Welcome to Old Path and our Monday study through the Old Testament. We are down to our last two of the Proverbs, and we're at Proverbs 30, obviously, because of that. And let's go ahead and turn there, and a couple of very, very quick things to address. I'll still be doing this for a little bit of time, hopefully because maybe somebody's seeing this or hearing it for the first time. But we are moving forward with our trip to Israel coming this October, and we'll be leaving on the 20th. There's a lot of details to the trip, and actually some things that people have misunderstood a little bit about the trip as well, when it comes to the cost and all of that. So I'd like to address that. If you have any questions about it, if it's matters of safety, if it's a matter of any number of things, please feel free to contact me through the ministry's website, oldpaththeology.net, and there's an email form that's there. I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. And again, we get those questions answered or asked quite often about matters of security and cost, and is there any hidden cost to it? We get a lot of those kind of things. So I'd love to be able to address it. There is the safety concerns that people have, thinking that some people actually just for whatever reason think that the entirety of Israel is at war and it's unsafe from top to bottom. And that's not the case at all. If it was, I wouldn't be going. So feel free to contact me if you'd like to go. Honestly, there's nothing like it, and been to a number of places and have traveled a bit over the years. But Israel is one of a kind as far as its place in the world, especially among believers, for obvious reasons. So it's pretty life-changing. So moving on to one other thing, I've been doing all of these apologetic topics. One that I decided I'm doing a little bit out of sequence, hadn't planned on doing it, but every once in a while, we will get people who will comment or send me an email and have a few other things to say about the length of my hair. And of course, they love to quote 1 Corinthians 11. So I want to address that and take a look at what the passage has to say and kind of jump into that. So maybe some of you might have that question as well and just felt awkward about asking it. So let me address it. And so the idea of men with long hair, and what exactly is Paul talking about in 1 Corinthians 11, and we'll take a look at that, and I'll answer that question. So Proverbs chapter 30, let's go ahead and turn there if you haven't already done so. Let's have a word of prayer and we can dive right in. Father, we thank you once again for the privilege of looking at your word and seeing what it instructs us. We ask, Lord, that you would help us in our understanding of what we see here and the importance of making proper application to what we read. And so we give you thanks that we have your word preserved for us and that you have given these things to us that we could walk rightly and honorably before you. So we give you thanks and pray that by the work of the Holy Spirit, we would have everything necessary for us to understand and again, make that proper application to your word. So we give you all thanks and praise and ask that you'd glorify yourself through the teaching of your word in Jesus' name. All right. So chapter 30. Now, these last two are not credited to Solomon, though you find some people who will say that these are names that we don't have any familiarity with. The father, I believe, that's being addressed here. No, I'm sorry. It's one of the two friends. You will find him mentioned or you will hear the name mentioned. These are proper names. At least every name had a meaning, but here it appears as though they're proper names. And the only one that's mentioned is one of the two friends in a genealogy given in Nehemiah 11. We don't even know if it's the same guy. So there are some who would say, because of the descriptions of the names and what the names actually mean, that it might be a veiled way of saying that it's Solomon. But really, even when you read through it, the construction of it looks a little bit different than Solomon. So it's my view of this, that this really is a person, the son of another person, writing to a couple of other people. And some would say, is it again, along the lines of what Solomon has done? Is it an older man writing to younger men? Are they sons? Any of the rest of that? None of that stuff is really going to change ultimately what we read here. There are some things about this, though, that are just incredibly profound. And some other things that are just very much like what you see in the Proverbs. It's just a person as they kind of think through things and ponder various things, looking at the world around them and making observations. But there are a couple of things in here that are just really, really amazing when you stop to think about the implication of them. And I don't think of them as being prophetic. I don't think that they're speaking prophetically, but they ask and we'll see right up front, there is a question asked in the rhetorical sense, asking it in a various ways. And the idea that we get Jesus, I believe, addressing almost as though he's addressing this particular part of the proverb or the Proverbs is pretty amazing. There are other observations about just the nature of men, and it parallels almost perfectly with something that Paul warns about, of being a kind of a condition of people in the last days. So I just find it fascinating that there are times that you see things written in the Old Testament that really are expansive in their description of the same kind of things, but in the New Testament sense. And really, that was the tack that I took with this book, the book of Proverbs, on Sunday mornings when I was still in California, looking at it, of saying, here are the things that we see spoken, but they really have an expanded view when we read them in the New Testament. I'll give you a couple of examples of that today. So the first verse is really just an identification of who the person is, and we'll find the same thing as we look at next week. These are two of the Proverbs that are just outside the mold of the typical ones of Solomon. And so this one here, again, if they are proper names and these are actual literal people and they're not really kind of code trying to give us a thinly or a veiled way of saying that they're actually someone else, you can find people that will try to make that case. I don't see the necessity for it. I see these as being incredibly practical things that this particular proverb has to say, and interesting in their implications in the New Testament sense. But I really do believe that this is just one person, the son of another person, writing to two other people, and then the things that are said here. So with that, let's take a look at the proverb itself. Chapter 30, verse 1 tells us the words of Agur, the son of Jekah, his utterances. And some would, depending on what translation you might be looking at, some say that this is kind of like an oracle or a prophecy, but I don't buy that. These are just observations and some things that are said almost in the rhetorical sense. Well, it says, this man, he declared this to Ithiel and his friend, another person, Ukal. So I don't know if I'm saying those names anywhere near correct, but these are the four people that are mentioned here. So even if we didn't have verse 1, and you said this was a proverb of Solomon, it's not going to change the internals of it at all. So that's why I don't worry myself so much about what the people love to argue about in the first verse. It really is incidental, and so let's just go with what it says. There's four people mentioned here, three of which their names, as mentioned here, the only places that you'll find those names in the entirety of the Old Testament. So obviously these are not people that we know of, but the instruction that's here is really, really profound, really important. Now, he says this is kind of a self-assessment, and the English is a little bit difficult for us to understand. When you first read it in English, you would think that this person sees himself as just this horrible, ungodly person. It's rather more of a matter of kind of, I would say, more along the lines of self-assessment. And so when he recognizes the holiness and the purity of God, and then views himself in the same way, he sees himself as being completely inadequate. And again, trying to ponder the great things of God, looking at ourselves in the mirror, we would think, who am I? You know, who can possibly do this? I don't care who you are. But that rift or that gulf between the greatness and the purity and the inexplainable greatness of God and his eternal state versus temporal man and all of our failings. The difference, the gulf between those two things is immense. And to the New Testament believer, that is lessened to some point. Not that there's that lack of gulf between the two, but the idea that Jesus came to dwell among his creation and bridge that gap, if you will, not elevating us to a different place and not lowering himself, but being a bridge between the two. And that idea that the day will come when our temporary existence is done away with and we are gathered to him, and all of our failures and all of our sinfulness and our fallen kind of things that we do will all be gone. All of that corruption is done away with. And then that fellowship is once again restored as Adam and Eve had before the fall. So what an amazing thing. And he kind of opens with that kind of, as he views himself as like, who am I? similar to what David did in the Psalms. When I consider the heavens, the work of your hands, the sun and the stars, who is man that you're mindful of him, or the son of man that you would visit him, that you would, have dialogue or make yourself known to him. And so it's that same kind of just trying to wrap your head around the idea of the great God having any interaction with this lowly creation we call mankind. So he says, surely I am more stupid than any man, and that's without learning. It's not him, being false in his assessment of himself, but he makes himself have really no reputation. Yet the things that he says are very, very high. They're very wonderful. So he says, surely I am more stupid than any man, and do not have the understanding of a man. I neither learned wisdom nor have knowledge of the Holy One. So it's like I'm not this educated person. I don't have the pedigree that many might have that claim otherwise. And so he says, I'm just a human. I'm just a person. And so who am I that, I'm going to try to compare myself to these people who are so learned. Interestingly enough, the people that claim the greatest amount of education in our world today, especially when it comes to biblical things, are some of the most puffed up, arrogant people that you will ever meet. And when you kind of work through what it is that they think that they believe and the knowledge that they've come to, you just wonder, how are you any different than anyone else? Your education is just simply your education, but it doesn't make you better in your understanding of who God is. Not at all. In some cases, it would seem that the education has become somewhat of an obstacle. So interesting that he has this assessment of himself, but look at what he says here in verse 4. It is absolutely amazing. And it's kind of capped between the two extremes, or the two parts in the end and the beginning of it. The middle part sounds very reminiscent of what Job would have had to say as he looked at the world. In a number of different places, he just talks about God who does these things, and God answers at the end of that saying, yeah, I actually do all those things, and there's no one like me. Who can do the things that I do? So here's chapter 4, or verse 4, has some incredibly important implications, and yet some very familiar sound to it when you consider it in the book of Job. So he says this. Now, first of all, the first part, verse 4, who has ascended into heaven or descended? Who has gathered the wind in his fist, and who has bound the waters in a garment? And who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name, and what is his son's name, that I should know? So he asks the question in the most rhetorical way possible by talking about the greatness of the creation. And, if you could reason with him like you would reason with a man, who is he that I could reason with him and explain these things? Because he does understand the vastness of what he sees around him. This is incredibly reminiscent of what we saw in the book of Job. And so there's no question about that. But the ascending and descending is fascinating when you stop to consider it. It's also an amazing thing when you stop to see that he puts this to, and it isn't as though I believe he's trying to speak prophetically. Who is he and who is his son? I think he's using more the terms that we would understand of just the idea of the mortal person. But he can't possibly grasp just how profound that sounds to the modern day believer who views Jesus as the Son, as he identified himself. And he uses some of this exact same terminology, the same kinds of things. So the place that we could look at to best describe and best to understand this, the idea of who can actually go between. So he would look at this and say, no man could ever say that they descended from heaven or that they could ascend back. Man is here, he's temporal, God is eternal, and he's above us. So who's the one who could say that they could bridge the gap? And of course, at his time, no one could make such an incredible statement. But let's take John and the way that he addresses this. In John, it's pretty obvious that we see there's some things that he makes in his observation in chapter 1. And so when we turn to the Gospel of John, we'll do that in just a moment, but we're not going to go to chapter 1. Let me just set it up if I could. In chapter 1, John is explaining the theology behind who the person of Jesus is. And in the first 3 verses, he gets to the point where Jesus is eternal. He was face to face with God the Father, and he himself is God, and he is the creator of all things. We settle that in the first 3 verses. And it works perfectly with what we read in Genesis chapter 1, because it was in the beginning Elohim created the heavens and the earth. And the Elohim is the verb, or the noun rather, description of God if he can be spoken of as plural, as that there is one God but manifested in a different way. That's why it's not in the beginning Jehovah created. It's in the, I just say that the way that we say it in English, Jehovah. I know people get really worked up about not pronouncing it properly. But it doesn't say in the beginning, YHWH, Yahweh, Jehovah, created. It says instead Elohim. And so if you're going to try to explain God in the plural sense, not being a bunch of different gods, but God singular manifested in persons, you would use Elohim. And then we get in John 1, that is all worked out for us in the first few verses. Well, that's where did he come from? He has always been. It's when you read in verse 14 that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He descended. So God came from the heavens in the person of Jesus, and he dwelt among his creation. And we beheld his glory as the only begotten. So that's what you get in the opening chapter. That's John explaining the theology behind the person of Jesus being eternal and with the Father and being God himself, but then coming to dwell among mankind, his creation. So with that understanding, look at what he ends up saying. Let's go to John chapter 3, because some of the things that he says here is pretty profound in that Jesus, it's almost as though he's giving an answer without identifying that he's looking at Proverbs. And he may not very well have had Proverbs in mind, but he answers the rhetorical question asked in this proverb. So it says, in the proverb, if you have a finger in both places, at verse 4, who has ascended into the heaven, or who has descended? Now notice there's the other things here. Who has gathered the wind in his fist, or bound the waters in a garment? Who has established the ends of the earth? Again, here Jesus is speaking as the creator when he's having this discussion with Nicodemus. But even one of the things that he mentions here, like at the first part where he says, who has gathered the wind in his fists? The point is that when you see the wind, you can see the effect of it. You see it, in the trees or whatever else, but you really don't know where its place of origin is, and you don't know where it's going to ultimately go. Now, right now, you may have actually heard, I've got thunder happening outside, and if I go to a radar, I'll be able to see that there's a system passing through. I'll be able to tell whether it's dropping from the north and kind of turning, or I can see if it's coming directly from the west or from the southwest. If I just look at the satellite, it's there. So I can tell the direction of the wind. I can tell where it's going to go. But you can see with forecasts, you never know how far north, how far, south, east, west. How far is it going to go? How long will it rain? What will the winds be like? You don't know. You can know the general direction, but you don't know the ultimate end course. There's too many variables. But who does know those things? Well, God certainly does. Look at how Jesus addresses that very same thing. Because he's talking about the idea of birth and then spiritual rebirth and the necessity to be born again. So he says, in verse 8, Jesus saying this, the wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. And so is everyone who is born of the Spirit. So ultimately, the Spirit knows where things are being led, and the people who have put their trust in God and who are led by his Spirit, they have a better understanding of where they're headed, but the rest of the world can't even figure it out. It's an interesting way that Jesus refers to this, and it really does help to cast some light on the rhetorical question. As he says here, who has gathered the wind in his fists? So who has any idea of where the wind is coming from or where it's going? Who has mastery over that? Well, Jesus would say, the believer doesn't have mastery over it, but they are the ones who are being led, and the Spirit has ultimate mastery over those, as does God as a whole. The Father, the Son, the Spirit, they all work in concert in these matters. So as he goes on, Jesus has a few other things to say here. And again, I don't want to go too long in this because I want to stay with the proverb. But he says he's trying to reason this thing through with Nicodemus, and he's not getting it. He's not understanding that there's a physical birth and that there is a spiritual rebirth. So he says this, now if I have told you of earthly things and you do not believe, then how are you going to believe if I tell you of heavenly things? No one has ascended to heaven, but he who came down from heaven, or descended, and that is the Son of Man who is in heaven. So here, that idea of ascending and descending, here Jesus has no problems with any of that. He's the only one who actually can fit the question that's posed here by the writer of this proverb. Now, turn to chapter 6 of the Gospel of John. And this is also one of those places where that idea of ascending and descending, this is not a problem for Jesus. Where had he always been? He had always been present with the Father in heaven. We know about him mostly because of what he did while here on earth. But when he left earth, where did he go? He returned to where he had come from. Look at his prayer in chapter 17 of John, and look at the way that it begins, because it starts with him saying, I'm about to return to you from where I came. That's the idea of he's going to, again, ascend, having descended. He came here and dwelt among us, gave his life on a cross, and then he ascended back to the Father until he comes to return to the earth. Well, he'll return for the church first, and then he will return to the earth ultimately to set up his kingdom. We're going through all of that information on our Thursday studies through the book of Revelation. But he has said here at this point, if you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. You know, you're going to die. There's nothing. You have to partake of flesh and blood. That's what he says. That's impressive. He says that, and it can be taken one of two ways. He's either speaking literally, or he is speaking in the way of his body and his blood being symbol of something that is to be partaken of. Now, if he's speaking in the literal sense of eating flesh and drinking blood, he's going to violate the law of God according to Leviticus. So to me, there's no question that he's speaking about a symbolic type of a thing, and it helps us what I'm about to read to you on that matter. But again, if he's talking about literal eating flesh and drinking, blood of any kind, that was completely forbidden in the law. You don't do that. The life is in the blood. It's been given as an atonement. You don't consume that. So Jesus would be speaking about this in a symbolic manner. Now, there will be people that will argue until they're blue in the face that he's meaning it literal. That's fine. Let them argue. I've tried with many people, and it goes nowhere to try to argue this, especially since it's like, how do you get around the idea that Jesus, being a Jewish man, perfect in the law, would somehow violate the law? It's just absurd on its face. Well, he said this, and it really bothered some people, needless to say. Verse 60 says, Now, therefore many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, This is a hard saying, and who can understand it? And Jesus knew in himself that his disciples complained about this, and he said to them, Does this offend you? Is this a scandalous thing to you? The word offend is scandalizo. Is this something that is a scandalous thing to you as well? Well, it says, What then if you should see the Son of Man ascend where he was before? And he says this, It is the Spirit who gives life, and the flesh profits nothing. The words that I spoke to you, they are spirit and they are life. It's the things that he is saying, not that he's going to have them consume blood. Because again, there's no life in the consumption of anything. There's life in the words that he speaks and the identifying with him as the one who has died and resurrected and paid the price for sin in his blood. So his point was, you're offended by this? Well, what are you going to say when you see me ascend up? Basically saying everything that I've told you, when you see it all come full circle and I ascend up into heaven, there will be no doubt what was meant by this and who I am and what authority I have. It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak, that I speak to you, they are spirit and they are life. But there are some of you who do not believe this, for Jesus knew from the beginning who it would be who would betray him. Obviously, it would be Judas. So I said, therefore, I have come, I have said to you rather that you cannot come to me unless it has been granted to him by the Father. So once again, the idea that somehow the eating of his flesh and the drinking of his blood is the thing that's going to give life. And that, again, there's churches, the Catholic Church in particular, they've made their entire mass is based on a very convoluted way of saying it's literal but not literal. It's a really odd thing to try to piece together how they view it, but ultimately that's because you're trying to get around the idea that Jesus could have actually advocated for something that would be completely against the law, making him a sinner. And if Jesus is a sinner, we're done. There's nothing left. It's over. So back to Proverbs. here is the simple answer to the question. At his time, there's nobody, because he asks it in the rhetorical sense of saying nobody could actually make the case for this. And in the person of Jesus, yeah, he actually makes the case because he actually did those things. He came from heaven and he ascended back to it at his ascension. The time when he finally was on the earth for the very last time, ascended into heaven, waiting for him to return. So when he returns, every eye is going to see him. At the rapture of the church, not every eye sees him. He doesn't come back to the earth. He doesn't step foot on it. He doesn't set up a kingdom. He does no such thing. He receives us to himself, as he said in John 14. It's the gathering together of the saints, and that's what we see in 1 Thessalonians 4. So it says now this in verse 5, which is really wonderful. Every word of God is pure, and that purity comes from the refining. That the way of basically saying that when God communicates, there's no refining necessary. It comes to us in its purest, most perfect form. There's no misunderstanding. There's no need of change or anything else in it. It is pure all on its own. It doesn't need anything. So every word of God is pure, and he is a shield to those who put their trust in him. What a wonderful, like, put it on your refrigerator kind of a thing. And yes, this is one of those places in the Old Testament that it's said in such a universal sense. It's not speaking directly to Israel. It's not speaking directly to any group of people at any particular time. This is just a generalized statement. Second part, do not add to his words lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. So the purity of his word and the idea that we can stand behind it, and that he, because we believe those things that he has said to be pure and perfect and applicable to our lives, those things, the word itself acts as our shield, but he is the one who enforces that. He's the one who stands, because we stand upon the truth and the purity of his word, the promises found therein, and that's where we stand. It's a shield to us, and he is that shield. So it tells us, now do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you, and you be found a liar. That's the idea of, if it's pure, don't expound on it. It doesn't need your help. Where do we see this, offended, and where do we see it addressed most directly? Look at the places, if you ever want an interesting study in it, look at the places where Jesus would say, you have heard it said, but I say to you. So, or in the place like when he was pulled aside by the Pharisees, is like, you guys don't eat with washed hands. Why don't you demand that your disciples eat with washed hands, like is the tradition of our people? Jesus basically said, those are your traditions. You've added to the law by all of your ceremonial washings and all the rest of it that are just kind of covering for the fact that you do all your ceremonial stuff, but your heart is not in it. You live by your traditions, but you have forgotten the basic word of God that demands no such thing. So Jesus did exactly this by, talking about the people that had taken God's pure word and made their own additions to it to the point where it was unrecognizable. Sounded pious, sounded wonderful. We should wash our hands, that whole thing about being clean and all the rest of it. It's not in the law. So there are a number of places where Jesus talked about the additions that they had added to the law, that he would say, I'll go back to where it originally was, what it's supposed to be. So there's going to be a series of these now where he starts to say about two things and maybe three, and he uses this really cool setup, if you will, to what it ultimately is. It's the last number that he gives in the sequence. There's 2, 3, or 4, and then he ends up giving you the 4, not the 2. You'll see what I mean as we go through this. So he says, now, this is where in verse 7, it's not as though there's a transition. It's as though when he says these things, it's really ultimately God that he's addressing as he throws these things out there, but his readers are moving along with him. Because again, he's not asking the people who are reading this, it's more addressing it to God. Who has ascended from heaven and who descends? It's that I'm seeking answers here. So he continues that, and he says, now, 2 things I request of you, and some translations is require. And so it's not like you're going to make demands of God, but in order to walk rightly, these are things that I need from you, God. So he says, 2 things I request of you, and that you is not the guys that he's writing to, but it's the Lord. He says this, remove falsehood and lies far from me. Now that one's pretty much straightforward. Let me be an honest, faithful man. And if I'm not, it's going to show in other ways. But these 2 things, above everything else that he could ask, these are the 2 things. Help me to be honest, straightforward, faithful. help me to be trustworthy, all those kind of words that you can throw along with it. But it's going to be based upon this. His word is his bond. He's faithful to it, that there wouldn't be any lies, deceit. There wouldn't be anything that would cast doubt on the veracity of his words. That part, and he doesn't ask for any, or doesn't make any kind of addition to it. Now this one here, give me neither poverty nor riches. So if you only looked at those two, here's the two things I want to be. Help me to be honest and not lie, and help me not to be too rich or to be too poor. This one he actually spends some time on, and he sees the problem with both. To be rich or poor, there's the potential for problems that come with it. Look at what he says. Feed me with the food allotted to me, whatever it is that is acceptable. And so whatever it is that is sufficient, let me be content with that. This is contentment that he's talking about. Feed me with the food that is allotted to me, and here's why. Lest I be full and deny you, have so much that I no longer dependent upon you. And then I would say, who is the Lord? Because now I'm sufficient. I've got everything that I would possibly need. And God has given them this caution. Go read Deuteronomy 7. Same kind of a thing. Be careful once you come into the land, because everything that you walk into, when you get there, God is speaking in Deuteronomy 7, they hadn't come into the land yet. Be careful when you get there, because when I bring you into the land that I'm bringing you into, you're going to take over lands that are not desolate. People have lived there. They've built homes, they've built vineyards, they've dug cisterns. Everything necessary for you to exist is already there, and it's going to be given to you. And be careful, do not forsake, do not forget, because it will be taken from you in like fashion, and it'll become that of somebody else. Somebody else is going to take everything that you've labored for, and it's going to become theirs. So be careful. Same kind of a caution. So he says, help me not to be to the place where I have excess, because then I'll start saying, who's the Lord? So he says the second part, or lest I become poor, and really I'm forced to become to the place of stealing, and then I would profane the name of my God. So I don't want to get to the point of beggary, or even worse, theft, and that would be a profaning. Oh, you call yourself a believer in God, and yet here you would steal from someone else. So it's that point. I don't need to have too much. I don't want to be put in the place of having nothing, because both of them are going to come at a price. I would rather have and be content with whatever you provide, that it would be enough. And that's going to be an interesting thing that he's going to continue with. So it says, this just very simple, straightforward, do not malign a servant of his master. And the maligning means that it doesn't mean that you might bring some concern to somebody about, to the person who is in charge of someone else, and that person has done something wrong. You're not told in the scriptures to just cover that up. This is the maligning, means that there's malice behind it. You're making a case that's not accurate. Don't go to the person who's in charge of someone else and bring a false accusation against them. Why? Lest he rather curse you and you be found guilty. The person that's hearing it is going to say, you're a liar. It's not true. There's no foundation in what you've said. Now you're accursed. It's going to come back on you. Verse 11. Now, listen to this. This is fascinating. This is verses 11 to 14. As I read this, I'm hoping that you know exactly where I'm going next on this. And so we'll test your Bible geekery right here. Verse 11. There is a generation that curses its father and does not bless its mother. There is a generation that is pure in its own eyes, yet is not washed from its own filthiness. There is a generation, oh, how lofty are their eyes, and their eyelids are lifted up. There is a generation whose teeth are like swords, and whose fangs are like knives, to devour the poor from off of the earth, and the needy from among men. Now, there are times that you'll see generation, and it could mean like nations. It could mean, the word is ethnos. Sometimes you'll see the word ethnos is mentioned as peoples or even generations. So it could have a number of different meanings. This is more like there is a generation, meaning that there's a group of people at any one particular time. Do I think that he's speaking about in future times? Not necessarily. He could be very easily speaking about his time or any time when these kind of people exist. And so you can see the different things. There's just these ways that they conduct themselves. They capitalize on other people. They victimize other people. They have dishonor for their parents. They have all variety of things that really the fruit of their lives is a definite indication of the fact that they are devoid of any kind of recognition of God or any kind of a fellowship with him. You can just see it by their actions. Now, when you read that, again, let me read it one time through really quickly, and keep your finger here. He says in verse 11, there is a generation that curses its father and does not bless its mother. There is a generation that is pure in its own eyes, yet is not washed from its filthiness. There is a generation, oh, how lofty in their own eyes, they're filled up with pride and their own hubris. There is a generation whose teeth are like swords and whose fangs are like knives. The things that they say are damaging and injurious to the people who they speak with. To devour the poor from off of the earth and the needy from among men. They capitalize on other people's weakness through entreaty, whatever they might be able to say, their flowery words and whatever else, but they're just looking to victimize people. Now, if you don't know where I'm going, turn with me to the book of 2 Timothy, and we're going to go to chapter 4. And you can do this a lot more in your own time, and so feel free to do this and do a comparison of these two things, and you'll find that there's some real similarities here. Now, I don't believe for a moment that this proverb is speaking about what Paul is addressing here. It's just more of a human condition. Paul is going to be a lot more descript, but it's still the same kind of thing. Corrupt people will do corrupt things because of the evil of their minds. That is what Proverbs is talking about. There is a generation. There are these people or these times when people dominate the time, and these are their characteristics, and you can look at it. So no authority, no parents. They don't regard anyone of any importance. They capitalize on people. They do damage. That whole type of thing. Look at what Paul says, and notice in the context of this. He already starts it earlier in chapter 2, the idea of deception as it makes its way into the church. And yeah, it's the church that he's talking to here, and being aware of it. And people can go ahead and disagree all they want to about, are these people professed believers that come in? No matter how it is, he's writing to Timothy about be careful in the church, because that's where these people will manifest themselves. So he says, but know this, that in the last days, this is where we get the word eschatology. So the last is the eschatos. It's as a timeline. When it comes to the days of mankind on the earth, the end times would be the eschatos of days. So as the Lord returns, notice that there's going to be perilous times within the time. In the last days, the eschatos, at the end of things, there will be times of peril that will be different in their magnitude. So what's being spoken of is a very general thing in the book of Proverbs. There's a generation. There are people who will do these things. Paul says, yes, there are those people who will do those things, and it will be worse at the end of times than it has been before, because it's perilous. It's unparalleled. It hasn't been before like this. So Paul says this, and remember, he's writing 2,000 years ago. Men are going to be lovers of themselves. That's the pridefulness, again, that is being observed in Proverbs. Paul is saying it's still happening today. So again, it's very open-ended. It's very general in Proverbs. Paul's making it very specific as being a condition of the end times. So he says these are going to be people who are lovers of money. They're boasters and they're proud. So he's addressed that in Proverbs. They're going to be blasphemers. They're going to be disobedient to parents, also talked about in Proverbs. They're going to be unthankful and unholy, unloving and unforgiving. They're going to be slanderers, without self-control. They're brutal, despisers of good. They're traitors. They're headstrong. They're haughty. They're lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. So he makes this assessment of them. This is everything that we read about in the Proverbs 30, verse 4 passage, and a lot more. Now, the problem is this litany of descriptions. These are kind of adjectives. These are things that this is a way of describing who they are. The problem is they are lovers of themselves in verse 2, and in the end of verse 4, they're lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. So they don't love God, they love themselves, and this is how they act out. That's the stuff that's in between those two phrases there. But here's the important part. They have a form of godliness, but they deny the power. That's how we know that these are people in the church. And these are, from such people, you need to turn away. These are the sort who will creep into households, and they will take captives gullible women loaded down with sin. And they're always learning, but never coming to an understanding of the truth. So they capitalize on other people. They victimize other people. They see them as the easy way. Now, so when you read Paul's description of the end times, it is a very much more focused and speaking about the worst of the times that we'll see at the end of days. But notice that there's nothing different. How impressive is this? If this proverb was written any time around Solomon's time, Paul's writing 1,000 years after Proverbs, and the problem still remains. Looking around the world today, if we're speaking about the end times, clearly when Paul wrote that, then there's still another 2,000 years after he wrote it. So you can say from the time of the Proverbs to our modern days, we see this characteristic of mankind. And man left to his own devices will do these things. But when it comes to the end, it will be worse than ever before. And these are the kind of characteristics that you would expect to see in the world around us. Paul's saying you'll see it around the church. These are people who have a form of godliness, but they deny the power. So they have some level of access to the godly people around them, but here's how they will conduct themselves. Pretty amazing. Back to Proverbs. Now, at verse 15, the leech has two daughters. Now, what an interesting picture this is. The leech, and so the word here is sometimes translated horse leech, but just let's make it the most general sense. What do we know about leeches? Leeches look like snails without a shell. They'll find flesh and they will attach themselves to it and begin to drain the blood from whatever it is that they're attached to. In this case, they have two daughters, Give and Give. This is really brilliant and actually even kind of funny. So a leech has two daughters. What are their names? Give and Give, the same name. So with a leech, that's all it's ever going to do. Bloodsucker. That's all that it's going to ever do. And so it has two daughters, leech. Now, there are three things that are never satisfied, and four never get enough. Now, the satisfied and enough are not the same exact words, but they still have the same intended meaning. So there are, as he observes the world around him and says, this really kind of goes to that idea of the futility of this existence, that there are four things that he's going to show here that they never find satisfaction in what their cry is, what they demand. So look at those four things. So again, the futility, the satisfied, it really never has its fill. Let's just look at it that way. And then the second part of never being enough, it's never sufficient. It'll never be satiated. It'll never be taken care of. So in verse 16, these are the four things. The grave, and that's there's never a time when people would be put to death and the grave says, I don't have any more room. Well, the grave always has room for one more. The second is the barren womb. So there's never going to be a satisfaction to that. The womb that a woman would want to have a child, but she'll never reach satisfaction. Just like the grave will never say, I've got enough. She'll never be able to say, I don't have any. I don't have enough. It'll never be something that will be enough or taken care of. That need will never be met. And so the grave has a need for bodies. It'll never have enough. The barren womb has a need for a child, and it'll never have enough. The earth is not satisfied with water. So when rain happens, it goes right into the ground, and even if it pools up, it will eventually go back to the ground. The earth will never get to the point where it's saying, I've had enough rain. If it does, it just floods. And as soon as the floods recede and the ground gets dried out, it'll take more on. Same thing, the fire never says enough. So this is one thing you know for sure. As far as a fire is concerned, so long as it has a source, it will continue to consume whatever you put in it. So fires are never satisfied. They can only be put out. They're starved of fuel. Verse 17, interesting. The eye that mocks his father and scorns obedience to his mother. Once again, that idea of disobedience, which is totally against the law of God. The law of God said respecting of your father and mother. And again, it assumes a perfect world. A father and mother who are right before God and walking in accordance with the law, then a child would, of course, want to be respectful to the mother and father because they're giving him godly guidance. A child, a son or daughter, they would look to their parents and say, godly people giving godly advice, I want to heed that. It's when those parents would do all of those things, but the child chooses rebellion. That's a problem. That's who's being spoken of here. And it says, the ravens of the valley will pick it out, and the young eagles will eat it. The eye. So remember, the eye is really the thing that beholds and sees. Jesus talks about the eye as being the gate, and that it really is that it looks into the heart, the soul. So basically that same kind of a thing. The eye who looks at the parents, that idea of looking at them with disdain and hate, will ultimately be the person that falls in the valley, and the birds will pluck that same eye out that he looked upon with disdain, the people that he should have love for, mother and father, and the animals will always just pluck out the eye. That's one of the first things that they go after. It's pretty gross. And there are a lot of the things in here that are just like really graphic that he says that are also profound. Now, verse 18. There are 3 things which are too wonderful for me, yes, 4 which I do not understand. And a couple of these are really, there's different ways that this is looked at. So let's look at the 4 that are mentioned here. The way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of a sea, and the way of a man with his virgin or with his maiden. Now, there is not agreement on all of this. So the way they might look to it, or look at the first 3, let's deal with the first 3. The way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent on the rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea. So they're all in their places, like see an eagle or any kind of an animal that's flying. You can see what they're doing, but you have no idea where they're going to go next. Or the other view of this, they'll do what they do, but there's never a trace left of them. So same thing with a serpent on a rock. It may move and everything else, and you can say they don't know where they're going to be going, but they also won't leave a trace. Or a ship, same kind of a thing. It's out on the water, but you don't know where its destination is. You also don't see that it leaves a track. Maybe it leaves a wake initially, but that all settles out. So those are the 2 ways that some people look at this. Now, the 4th one is the one that really doesn't, there's a lot of different views on this. It is the person that's being spoken of as the maid, the virgin, is she actually legitimately that, or just purporting herself to be that? Or is it the man who looks to entice someone with the promise of marriage and everything else, and then seduces her and then lets her go? There are a lot of different views on this whole thing. And again, if we make the same application for the first 3, the idea of a guy who would do something like that, if he's that evil, you just don't know where where does he wind up? Where is he going? What's his intention? Or does he even leave behind any kind of a wake of his treachery? And that kind of a looking at it like that, yeah, you can see the wake and the treachery of a person and the collateral damage that comes with it. So this would kind of be more, what's the thought process, and how does a man manage to do the things that he does? And it's by beguiling someone who is, at this case, pure, and this is a person looking to defile. But what goes through that? What is that makes that happen? How does that work? What's the calculus behind it? And so the writer of the proverb for these 4 things is like, help me understand what goes on in this, and how does this work? So in verse 9 or verse 20, this is the way of an adulterous woman. She eats and she wipes her mouth and then says, I have done no wickedness. And so the eating is something that goes along with the proof of her bad actions. And the idea of wiping it away from her mouth is the removal of the evidence and saying, what did I do? You get the picture. Verse 21. For 3 things the earth is perturbed, and that means just kind of, it's perturbed is like it's shaken, it's troubled. There's difficulty that comes upon the earth because of these things. So he mentions it, these 3 things, for 3 things the earth is troubled or perturbed. Yes, there are 4 that it cannot bear up. So he starts with that 3, but now 4, so we're going to get 4 examples. A servant when he reigns, a fool when he is filled with food, a hateful woman when she is married, and a maidservant who succeeds her mistress. So again, just the observation, there are 4 things that he's going to mention here, and as he puts it, that really will trouble the world. And so the first one that he mentions is a servant when he reigns, a person who has no clue what it is to like lead and be the top when he's just been a servant. All he's ever done is observed, and probably has a pretty jaded view of what a person looks like when they reign, and he's going to be a horrible person at that point to be in any place of rulership. The second of these is a fool who is filled with food. And so a fool is a person who has no understanding of the things that they have, but then they have an excess, or they have food. They have everything that they could want, but they have no idea of how to govern it. The third of these things would be the married woman when she is married, or the hateful, the angry, the quarrelsome woman when she is married. Now that could either mean that the poor guy that she's going to abuse, or the idea that she used to have such disdain for people like her, and now she's one of them. Everybody's going to be miserable as a result of her. And you really don't know for sure what he's getting at here, but you can make plenty of applications from it. And then the last one is a maidservant who succeeds her mistress. So again, that person who sits there in waiting, and what will she do when the person that she serves is gone, especially if it's left to her or given to her, that she's not ready to be that person. She's been lying in wait the whole time, if that's what he means by this. But you can see examples of that throughout the history that we have, not only in human history, but we even do see it in the intrigues around the kings at the time after Solomon. So verse 24, these four things which are little and they are upon the earth. So again, here's observations. It sounds different than the way that Solomon would phrase it, but you can still see that same thing. As I look around the world, these are the things that I see, and I try to make sense of them. Or I'm just awed by them because they don't necessarily fit, they don't fit what you would think. He's going to have a point where there's a real majesty and a regalness to, for examples. These are like, nobody pays attention to them, but you ought to. And so here he says, there are four things which are little upon the earth, but they are exceedingly wise. They defy explanation. And here's what he says. First of all, the ants, they're like a people, or they are a people, but they're not strong, and yet they prepare their food in the summer. Yeah, so ants do that. When the things are good and plentiful, they will get it and store it up for the difficult times. We're at the point now here in Texas when we're getting the rains, and now we're starting to get those anthills that pop up, because now they're starting to emerge out, and we're starting to see the activity of them, and they're coming out all over the place. And unfortunately, we get fire ants here. So those are the mounds that hopefully you do not kick with bare feet, because you're going to hurt later. But that's not what's being talked about here, is that they make preparation. But there's nobody that's like telling them what to do. They're just industrious this way. And this is what they do, of always being in a place of preparation and a continual, replenishment of their people, of their species. So the rock badgers, they are a feeble folk, yet they make their homes in the crags. Now, when he talks about what is a rock badger? What are we talking about here? And in Israel, we see these when we get up to, it's funny, just yesterday in church, we were looking at the place known as En-Gedi, and I gave some pictures to the pastor here to share with the congregation from one of our trips to Israel. And we were looking at the walking up to En-Gedi. That was the passage that we were in yesterday, going through it in 1 Samuel. And since En-Gedi is a place that's known when David cut the hem, or cut the part of Saul's robe, and then David confronts Saul, said, I could have killed you in that cave, but I didn't. I won't lift my hand against God's anointed. That area is known to us. And all throughout that area are these little rodent-looking kind of things that here they're referred to as rock badgers. Those in Israel would refer to them as conies, or as a hyrax. And really, they're just kind of like a really massive version of a guinea pig, ultimately, a little rodent kind of a thing. They don't have really natural defenses. They're kind of weak. They don't have very big mouths. They're not going to attack you or anything else. And yet they know they have enough sense to hide themselves in rocks, and the predators can't get at them. They're just wise that way. Like the ants, they're industrious. They know what they're doing. They're always making preparation. They're little on the earth, but they exist. They use what God has given to them. So he has this other one here. The locusts, they have no king, and yet they all advance in ranks. We've all seen that. When locusts descend on an area, they just move like a formation. It's almost like an army. And then he says, and then the spider. Now, this is the only place, a few of these descriptions are only found here. It's the only time the word is used. This is one of those cases, spider. Other translations will call it a lizard, because it's only used here, and it's a little difficult to track down exactly what he has in mind. But you get the picture. Whether it's a lizard or whether it's a spider, this is, again, one of those little small things, and yet It can be in a shack somewhere that hasn't seen the face of a human in years, or it can be in a palace. And it uses its hands, it does what it does, it's skillful in what it does. Lizard fits that, spider fits that. They're tiny little things, and you'll find them anywhere. They could be in a king's palace or anywhere else. Really interesting. So he says in verse 29, now there are 3 things which are majestic in pace, or as they move, and 4 which are stately in their walk. A lion, which is mighty among the beasts. So there's your first example. And so whenever we would see a lion moving and we see them, advancing as they do, there's a majesty to them. They're impressive to watch. And then he says, and he does not turn away from any. He's very, very confident. Who am I to be afraid of? There's just a majesty. They walk. They don't seem to ever be in a hurry unless they're chasing prey. But when they walk from place to place, they don't have fear of anything. They just advance. There's a majesty to them. Now, the second is referred to here as a greyhound. And this just means that it's, we don't even know, this is another one of those words. Does he mean greyhound like we think the dog? It just means their loins are girded. That's what the actual word here means. So it's just that when you look at a greyhound, you just think there's no fat on them. They're just all tight and together. That's what he's referring to here. He could be describing any variety of animals. We don't know. So greyhound is what we have here. It could mean anything. We don't really know because, again, the Hebrew word is very, very diverse. It could mean a number of different things. But anyway, what he has in mind is that idea that when you watch them advance themselves, there's a majesty to them. There's a strength. There's a power that is shown. And then the third is the male goat, which again, why a male goat? Have no idea. Once again, what's he thinking? If we're thinking also interesting, when we think of places like En-Gedi, there's the mountain goat, which is called the ibex. And we have seen those too when we're in En-Gedi, and they blend in really, really nicely. But these are not like the goat you think that you see out in the fields that are just chewing grass. This mountain is like, this is the horned kind of sheep. This is the really like a deer with big horns, but they're incredibly muscular. They're impressive to look at. So that probably is more what he's thinking about. And then, of course, the last of these is the king whose troops are with him. So an advancing army, like with the locusts, but in this case, the real thing, the king with his armies and the advancing. It's incredible to look at. There's a power and a strength with it. It's impressive and it's imposing as you watch it move along. Verse 32, if you have been foolish in exalting yourself, or if you have devised evil, put your hand on your mouth. That's like, stop yourself and don't go any further. If this is what you plan to do, if you've made these plans, if you've already done some, but you have some further, bring it to a stop. Put your hand over your mouth. Stop, cease, desist, don't go any further. For as the churning of milk produces butter, and the wringing the nose produces blood, so the forcing of wrath produces strife. Now this word here for churning and wringing and forcing is the exact same word in the Hebrew, and this is the only places that it's used. So the one that's most easily understood for us, the churning. If you're churning, and that's the mixing of cream until the point where it starts to solidify, that we get. There's a churning, there's a moving, there's a constant moving around. So if that same procedure type of a thing happened to the nose, it's going to produce blood. Or if it's the same stirring up of wrath, it's going to produce strife. So this whole thing, he's saying, look, if you've got a plan to do something awful, stop where you are, because what you're doing is you're churning it up like you would do butter, or you're smacking somebody or rubbing around their nose. It's going to bleed. Or if you're going to be causing wrath, you're going to stir up a result. And so you don't want the end result of any of that. Now with churning of butter, that's great. You like that. But if you just want to have the milk or the cream, don't agitate it, or else you're going to just turn it into butter. If you have a nose that's on your face and it's comfortable the way that it is, don't start churning it or doing that manipulation to it. It's going to bleed all over you. You get the point. So it's like, stop in your tracks if you're doing something that you know is not helpful. Now, We'll pick up with the very last of these, Proverbs 31, next week. Very much look forward to going through that, and it's misunderstood in a lot of different ways. So we'll have some fun with that. Now, as we close here, I wanted to address this idea of the length of men's hair, mine in particular, because some people seem to have a problem with it. So I thought, there's only one place that this is even discussed, and it is in 1 Corinthians 11. So let's take a look there, and let's see what is being discussed. Because, interestingly enough, this is one of those kind of situations where, like anywhere that you have something going on and it's addressed in the scriptures, but you don't find it addressed anywhere else, you realize this is probably a bigger problem in that particular location. And again, it's not as though Paul's there the whole time. We know that with most of the times that he's writing these epistles, it's not while he's there with them, but it's after the fact. So something's come to his knowledge, to his understanding, and he's going to address it. Now, Corinth was not without its problems. In fact, when you start to look at it, do yourself a favor. Take a look, if you were to just look at everything that Paul ever wrote, and do it by chapter, and add up the number of chapters in all of his writings, and then add the number of chapters that you see in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you're going to find he wrote more to the church at Corinth than just about all of the other things combined. So that means that there was a whole lot of stuff happening at Corinth. Not surprising. Look at where it is in the world. He didn't start churches in Athens, but it would have been the same kind of world. And ultimately, we know that he spent a lot of time at Ephesus as well, but he spent quite a bit of time at Corinth, and Corinth had a whole lot of messed up stuff going on. This is in the middle of paganism 101, kind of that part of the world. So apparently there's something that's going on there. All we can do is, and why I say apparently is because it's the only place where this is addressed. And the larger point is not about men's hair, it's about women and their presentation of themselves when they're in church. And the idea that they're not interested, some of these people, whoever they are, they're not identified, but it's something that's happening in the church, and Paul's going to address it. And the crux of the problem is that there are women apparently among the people in the church, because he says we don't have any of these things as like a blanket policy as far as the churches are concerned. So he's not talking about regular, out in the world kind of things. Now, would these women present themselves in the same kind of way in the culture, which could be an issue, but he's really kind of more addressing it as far as the church is concerned. So that's the backdrop for it. And however it was brought to his attention, what we have are women who were, what we might look at them today and say, these are women who don't want to, or they would rather erase the distinctions between men and women, and they would present themselves as though, seemingly in this case married, but not wanting to present themselves that way, and that there is no covering, because he's talking about coverings. Let's just read the whole thing. And again, most people will read this and just kind of scratch their head and go, I have no idea what this is about. Well, let's see in verse 3. I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, and that the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. So there's this order of things. Verse 4, sorry for the edit, the camera quit recording right at the end of verse 3. So verse 4, every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head. Again, the recognition that in the church, yes, he has the authority that God is his head, but as far as the church is concerned, there isn't somebody that would be in the church in the physical sense that he would show that. And you're going to see how he says that as far as the women are concerned. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that she is one and the same as if her head were shaved. So the point is, she won't recognize in the sense of the man versus the woman, or husband versus the wife. As far as the church is concerned, there is to be that understanding. He's going to develop that quite a bit as he goes on a little bit further, of the men in the fellowship are to be the heads, and the women are to be in the place of showing that there is a covering to them. Now, some see this as just pertaining to marriage, or is it to women in general, of the adult women. Again, this is only covered here in Corinth, and it's not spoken about in any of the other epistles. So why this is something that is brought up here is anybody's guess. So the point would be is if a woman is going to participate in the normal day-to-day of things, the praying, the prophesying, the speaking in church, but she doesn't have any kind of a covering, she's basically saying, I don't recognize any kind of an authority. I am my own authority. And it's the idea of not looking at what is normal, customary, expected to be as far as the church is concerned. And Paul's pretty much saying, why doesn't she just have her head shaved if she's that convinced that there is no authority over her? She shouldn't even have anything on her head, even her hair, let alone being veiled. Verse 6, for if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn, but it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved. Let her be covered. So let her just go do what is acceptable as far as the custom is concerned. So let's, again, remember, customary there, but customary in much of the rest of the world. And again, we're looking at something which would have been much more of a cultural issue to Corinth 2,000 years ago, or to the world itself, Christian world as they might understand it. So again, you read historians and history, I should say, there are some cultures that had no problems with it and other cultures that did. The idea of such decorum, if you will, as far as the church is concerned. But his point is, and really when you read the entirety of this verse, it's all about the conduct of what some of the women were doing at the church there in Corinth, and them saying, I don't have to, live to the standards that are put upon me by the church here. And it was that defiant, there's the blurring of the lines. So that's, at this point, that's kind of what's being discussed here. So verse 7, for a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God, but for the woman it is the glory of man. So as far as the way that God had put things in place to begin with, God created man, then created woman, which is what he's going to get into here. For man is not from woman, but woman is from man. All the way back to Adam, he was made first. God said he's incomplete. There's no question. I'm going to make a helper for him who is comparable to him. So not that he's making a second class. There's men and women as far as classes are concerned. It's just that they're incomplete. Husband without wife, wife without husband. There is an order that God had from the very beginning, and that's what's being pointed out here. So he says, nor was man created from woman, but woman from man. That's God caused a deep sleep, chapter 2 of Genesis, and that's where it's not good that man would live alone. That whole thing starts at around verse 7. So, nor was man created from woman, but rather woman from the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels, or because of the normal course of things, because of the order. So it says, for this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels, but nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For the woman came from man, even so man comes through the woman, or through natural childbirth. But all things are from God. It's his order ultimately, and he's the one who put these things in place. Man created first, woman created from man, but man could not be born, anyone after Adam couldn't be born without Eve or without the woman. So there's the physical birth as well. So it says, for woman came from man, and man from woman also comes man, but all things are from God. So judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Is it out of order? That's the issue. And so notice we've managed to make it all the way to verse 13 from verse 3 before he even mentions anything about the length of a man's hair. So that's clearly, the length of a man's hair is clearly not the topic at hand. He's simply explaining about what is normal order here. If there are women who are going into church acting like it's any other day and not looking to the authority of anybody above her as far as the church order is concerned, whether it be husband or men, there's disagreement on, is this intended to be spoken to married couples or women in the proper operation within the church. Either way, it's still going to be the same thing. But if we were looking at a church like this today, and if every church was living according to what's actually being spoken of here, then every woman would have something that would be either if he's just referring to the hair that's on their head as the covering, which again, disagreement on that, or a literal covering, something that shows that there is a covering that's on their head. And you can read the things that are written about this in the culture at the time. But for the people who like to make this an issue about guys' long hair, they don't look at the customary things that were taking place and why this might be relevant more so to Corinth than the other places, and why it's being addressed. So anyway, is there anything that was happening in society as far as that's concerned? And should the women not be like the women that are there in the rest of the world? Should they be shown differently? And should they conduct themselves differently in the church setting? That's really the upshot of this whole thing. And that's everything that he's been saying up to this point. But if we were going to be doing this in church, then all the women would be somehow uniformed, and they would all look the same, whether it's long hair or wearing some kind of a hairdressing type of a veil type of a thing. Some do it. The Amish do it. Mennonites do it. Some very, very, very formal Orthodox do it, but the women will have some kind of covering on their head. But it's not something that's really observed as far as the church is concerned. So we've made it all this way in this passage, and the idea of men's hair has not even been discussed. It's all about women. It's about covering. It's about the recognition that there is an order that God has put in place, men to women, and there's a way that is able to be seen, not blurring the lines. So that brings us to our passage that seems to have some people very upset. Verse 13. He asks the question, judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? It says, now, does not nature itself teach that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? So the length of hair is something that's kind of neutral. It is what it is. So apparently at this point in time, there is the recognition of the length of hair and what's actually being communicated through that. So if there is the distinction that all the women had long hair and all the men had short hair at Corinth there, but there were some women who were not wearing some type of covering, which that seems to be pretty much what he's pointing at, because if they don't want to wear one of those, then just shave their head. So again, he's being almost a little sarcastic in the whole thing about how ridiculous is this whole thing. So bottom line, there's got to be a way to distinguish between the women and the men, and there should be a visible way of doing that. So that means that there has to be something that's visibly defining the difference between the two, not blurring the lines. So here he says, doesn't nature itself show that? Well, what nature are we talking about? Because it's clear that men can wear their hair or grow it out just as long as women, unless they've got, balding and whatnot like that. So naturally, the natural human can, whether man or woman, can grow their hair long. It's just a process. But what is the shamefulness? What would be a shame if a man had long hair, unless he's trying to portray something that's not actual? As with the women, they don't recognize a covering, so they're going to blur that line and just be like the men. Well, if this works in reverse, were there men, would it be a shameful thing if a man was to grow out his hair and try to take on exactly what a woman is presenting? And I had a guy come onto the YouTube channel and make that case exactly about me. That you're blurring the lines, you're not being faithful to the text, you have long hair, as though that's what the whole thing was about. But again, I just had to laugh. I go, so should I shave off the mustache and complete the whole thing? Because if it is the idea that I'm trying to present myself as somehow effeminate, well, I think I'd probably grow it out a whole lot longer than I actually do. And I'd probably cut off the mustache, and I'd probably change the way that I talk to sound more like I'm trying to be like them, because this is all about blurring lines. That's the whole context of this. So it's not about the length of the hair, or else where's the length defined? What defines long and what defines short for a woman or for a man? There's nothing here that's given in this. So it seems like some people love to be contentious about this and make this about the length of hair rather than what would be behind it and what's the intent behind it. Because we know what it is with the women. I don't want to recognize the authority of anybody over me, so I'm not going to go with the normal decorum. Here, would men be doing something that makes them indistinguishable, which the women wanted to do with men, indistinguishable, I've got no covering? Are there men who wouldn't it be an unnatural thing or even shameful if a man were to go out of his way to blur all of the lines look and present himself just as though he's a woman where there's no distinction. And if somebody thinks that that's actually what I'm doing, man, there aren't enough words in the dictionary for me to try to explain how you've mischaracterized me. Do I present as effeminate? Because that's really got to be, if this is on being said as the reverse of what was being said of the woman, then that would mean that the man is trying to present himself in a way where there's no difference between he and the woman. So if people think that I'm presenting myself that way, when that's not even the discussion that's at hand here, he's just using it as an example of saying, you know, doesn't it just demonstrate that there are particular roles? So if somebody seems to think that I'm trying to present myself as a woman, man, I don't know how to help them. They're out of their minds. So they've got whole shows on television about guys who try to come off as women. I'm not one of those. So if the length of my hair is a problem, we don't have a measure here of what that is. Because if he says, well, it can't be to the shoulder blades or it needs to be above the neck, great, then I would say that, you know, he's making a big deal. If he was to say it that directly, in the church, men should not have hair that's any longer than their neck. He could have said it that way. Instead, he says it in more of a cryptic way that's an answer to what's already taking place with the women in the congregation. So interesting, we get to verse 15, which is the backside of it. If a woman has long hair, it's a glory to her. So clearly you can tell who's who. So in verse 16, but if anyone seems to be contentious, if you want to keep arguing about this whole type of thing, he says, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. We haven't had to deal with this in the other churches. They pretty much understand the roles and what's there, and that there's a distinguishing between men and women in those churches. If there are people who are trying to erase any distinction, that seems to be the issue that he's addressing here. But again, it's not even talked about in the other places. Any other places that are here, it's really only mentioned in one verse, and really the whole context of it picks up in verse 3, runs through verse 16. The whole discussion's found there. It's a portion of verse 14 that is all about the length of hair, as though that's the entire topic that's going on, which it's not. So again, if people have a problem with that, I can't help them. But to somehow think that some arbitrary measure, wherever that is, because again, we don't have a picture of it here in Corinth, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable, that's long, that's not long, it's not there. And it's not even the overall length of it, it's not told to us. So you probably should read it a second time and wonder, is there more going on here than what somebody might, by arbitrary standards, say that man's hair is too long, according to 1 Corinthians 11:14. That's just absurd on its face, but that doesn't stop people from making this an issue, and I can't help those people. But I thought I would address it because it's only found in one place. That's the only issue that where anybody can point to and have a problem with my hair. And again, if there's somebody listening to this, some guy who's got a problem with it, or even a woman who says, you know, you're presenting yourself as effeminate, man, I don't know what to tell you. If my presentation to you presents as woman, I don't know where we go from there. So questions on that, please contact me through the ministry's website. Love to discuss it with you further if you need to, or if you have a view or something that you think you'd want to bring to the attention of what the actual text says, great. If you want to debate this further on YouTube and all the rest of it, I might answer one or two of it, but I won't have it go on too long because I don't know what else I could possibly say that I haven't said on this recording. So if you have any questions, again, oldpaththeology.net is the website, and there's an email form there. You can use the drop-down menu and send me a question if you have it. Or if you want to discuss about the Israel trip, want information about it, please contact me through the website. And hopefully we'll see you for the book of Revelation, chapter 21. We start on Thursday, and we'll be completing the book of Proverbs next Monday, and I hope to see you then.